In Kyoto, with the coming of the black ships, there arose a warrior called Hitokiri Batosai. Felling men with his blood-stained blade, he closed the turbulent Bakumatsu era and slashed open the age known as Meiji. Then, he vanished, and with the flow of years, became a legend. Every spring, Japanese people gather to watch the beautiful cherry blossoms bloom and fall, with the drifting pink petals creating an almost ethereal dreamlike atmosphere. While the cherry blossoms are in and of themselves a thing of beauty, there's something deeper to this event. Setsunai, hakanai, or sorrowful and ephemeral. Cherry blossoms only bloom for a short time before returning to the earth, but even as they fall, they do so with grace and elegance. And I think that embodies Rurouni Kenshin, Trust and Betrayal. Trust and Betrayal is not only a near-perfect anime, but one of the most moving examples of this concept of the beauty of tragedy. The heartache of witnessing the end of something breathtaking, but the happiness at having experienced it. Rurouni Kenshin, Tsuiokuhen, or Samurai X, Trust and Betrayal, a misnomer because Kenshin is not a samurai, is an adaptation of part of the third arc of the Kenshin manga. Created by Nobuhiro Watsuki, Rurouni Kenshin debuted in Shonen Jump in 1994, and much like other Jump comics, was later adapted into an anime in 1996. But it wasn't until March 2003 when Western viewers were able to watch the adventures of the former assassin turned wanderer on Cartoon Network's groundbreaking programming block, Toonami. In shonen manga fashion, Rurouni Kenshin was a relatively light-hearted action-adventure story, with Kenshin and his friends facing off against various bad guys. In fact, the full title of the Kenshin manga is Rurouni Kenshin Meiji Kenkaku Romanta, or The Romantic Tales of a Meiji Swordsman. Not romantic like the romance between lovers, but romantic in the literary sense. An adventure story focusing on bravery and overcoming challenges. Kenshin's tales are divided into several arcs: the Tokyo arc, the Kyoto arc, the Jinchu arc, and the ongoing Hokkaido arc. The Tokyo arc introduced us to the aloof wanderer and the people who were drawn to him for his innate kindness. The initial adventures of the Tokyo arc, much as first acts in any story must do, set the stage by showing us the world and context in which the story takes place. We meet the characters, learn their beliefs, and the struggles they must overcome. It set the tone for the series. As Kenshin and his friends stumble into adventures, we begin to realize that not everything is as it appears with this itinerant swordsman. In the first episode, we see that his appearance is physically unimpressive. He has a small frame with long hair, and at a glance, one could easily mistake him for a woman. But his prodigious skill with the sword is unparalleled, and on his cheek is a cross-shaped scar which hints at a troubled past. His speech is idiosyncratic, with the constant use of hyper-mannered and humble language. The classic examples are his use of sessha and degozaru. Sessha is an archaic first-person pronoun in Japanese, which is extremely humble and doesn't really have a clear English equivalent, while degozaru is a very formal version of the be verb. Some translations approximate sessha to this one, and translations of Kenshin often use the English term that it is for degozaru. So instead of I am Kenshin, he might say something more akin to this one's name is Kenshin, that it is. But when engaged in extreme combat, he mysteriously switches to the extremely assertive, masculine, and boastful first-person pronoun, ore. We slowly learn that underneath his veneer of harmlessness is something dangerous, and even frightening, some darkness born in the past. The Tokyo arc showed us an idealized, bright, and optimistic Meiji era from Japanese history, a time of progress and modernization. But we quickly see the cracks in the system, the corruption and classism, a byproduct of the turbulent and sudden way Japan ushered in a new era. This comes to a head in the Kyoto arc, where the sins of the Isshin Shishi, those who overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate, come back to wreak havoc on Japan. Again and again, the tragedies of the past resonate to the present. They affect and shape the modern era. This is represented by Kenshin's trademark cross-shaped scar, a physical manifestation of past deeds for the lives spent and taken in order to bring about this new Japan. And much like Kenshin's wound, those sins can't be ignored or covered up, but must be remembered and come to terms with. And this, at last, brings us to Rurouni Kenshin, Trust and Betrayal. While the Jinchu arc was never fully made into anime form, we were blessed to receive this 4-episode OVA, which I consider one of the best anime works ever made. Set against the historical events leading up to the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, the manga had Kenshin flash back as he recounted his time as an assassin during the final years of the Bakumatsu. The OVA does away with this framing device, and treats Trust and Betrayal as the standalone prequel of Kenshin before he became the peaceful wanderer we grew to love. While we always knew Kenshin had a difficult life, Trust and Betrayal showed us that his history was filled with more heartache and misfortune than a person should have to bear. Trust and Betrayal has this tragic sense of inevitability, how happiness and sadness ebbs and flows. That everything good that happens eventually becomes a source of sadness and results in more suffering. That no matter what we do or the purity of our intentions, we can't escape a cycle where our happiness turns sour. How trust will always end in betrayal. But that misfortune can also turn to happiness. Over and over throughout the OVA, we see this cycle. Everything Kenshin does, every tragedy or misfortune Kenshin faces or indeed brings upon others as a killer, brings about a temporary bit of success, progress toward the new era, or a feeling of triumph for the leaders of the Isshin Shishi. But then, everything turns back to conflict and tragedy. Kenshin loses his parents, is sold into slavery, and is almost killed by bandits, only to be saved by Seijiro Hiko, the man who would train him in Hitten Mitsurugiru, giving Kenshin the opportunity to rise above his station as the son of a farmer. Becoming a skilled swordsman and hoping to bring an age of peace and equality, Kenshin became a respected member of the Isshin Shishi, the imperialists fighting to topple the Tokugawa government. But Kenshin's duty is to be a living weapon for politicians. Working directly under historical statesman Kogoro Katsura, Kenshin is used as an assassin, a grim job which affects him to his core. Throughout the 4-episode OVA, we get short glimpses of Kenshin's life as an assassin. Kenshin is as brutally efficient as you'd expect from a nigh superhuman swordsman. He strikes from the shadows, relying on Hitten Mitsurugi's trademark speed and his own specialization in Battojutsu, a subset of Kenjutsu, in which you draw your sword and cut with one motion. Kenshin's proficiency in Battojutsu earned him the moniker Hitokiri Battosai. He was rightfully feared among pro-shogunate forces and even his own allies. Kenshin's assassinations are shown as quick affairs, giving little time for his targets to offer meaningful resistance, and with Kenshin barely breaking stride. But the first mission we the audience see is well into his career as a hired killer, and it goes sideways. Kenshin quickly eliminates his targets, but one samurai manages a single cut which mars the Battosai's face. While not a serious wound, it is the first injury Kenshin has ever sustained from an enemy, and marked this encounter as a fateful one. This particular death results in Kenshin meeting the first love of his life, the beautiful and mysterious Tomoe. Encountering each other under a rain of blood as a would-be shogunate assassin tries to kill the Isshin Shishi's most potent and feared weapon, the fate of Kenshin and Tomoe would be forever tied. The upheaval in Kyoto finally reached a head on July 8, 1864. The pro-shogunate Shinsengumi attacked an inn called the Ikedeya, where a group of imperialists were meeting to discuss, as some accounts tell it, burning Kyoto. Fire being a serious threat in an era and in a city where all the buildings are tightly packed and made of wood. The Ikedeya incident was a significant setback for anti-shogunate factions, and within the story of Trust and Betrayal, Kogoro Katsura knew Kyoto was far too dangerous for him and Kenshin to remain. He ordered Kenshin and Tomoe to go into hiding as a married couple. From the ashes of the Ikedeya incident, these two would find a bit of happiness together. Tomoe falls in love with Kenshin as she sees that beneath this cold exterior he built around himself is still an innocent heart which naively believed that he could use his sword to make a difference, without considering the cruelty and death he would be responsible for. He, in turn, falls in love with her and vows that once the new era begins, he will never kill again, that they can live together in peace. But as this is a tragedy, we find that Tomoe came to Kyoto to find and kill the man who murdered her beloved, a young samurai named Akira Kiyosato, who was a mediocre swordsman, but had such a strong desire to live and reunite with Tomoe that he managed to land a single blow on the legendary Hitokiri Battosai. Torn between two conflicting loves, Tomoe chooses to protect Kenshin from death, but it was Kenshin who struck the blow which ended her life, in her final moments, creating the second cut on Kenshin's trademarked cross-shaped scar, and marking this moment as another which would always haunt the young swordsman. Over and over throughout the story, we see the cycle of triumph and tragedy. Trust and Betrayal raises an interesting question. Do we move forward because of tragedy, or in spite of it? The Rurouni Kenshin manga went through several subtle, stylistic phases throughout its run. This happens often in manga as the illustrator refines their technique and the tone of the story solidifies both in the minds of the creator and the audience. Kenshin's initial volumes had characters with more rounded and softer features, in some ways resembling a shoujo rather than shonen manga. Look at this cover and tell me the artwork isn't adorable. It screams lighthearted story. Fittingly, the artwork evolves to include sharper and streamlined angles as the narrative and themes become more focused, and Kenshin and company face off both physically and morally against the ghosts of the revolution. But through all the artistic evolutions, there is still a clear through line that screams bright and fun action story. It's always beautiful. It's always Watsuki. It's always Rurouni Kenshin. The Jinshu arc carried over Watsuki's refined but signature style, including the section from which Trust and Betrayal would be adapted. In the anime, Watsuki's playful artwork was complemented by whimsical instrumentals and upbeat J-pop, like the cool Heart of the Sword, or the annoyingly catchy earworm Sobakasu, a song which never fails to kick my ass in karaoke. The background music was an interesting mix of upbeat and relaxing, as well as the intensely exciting, although slightly anachronistic tracks for action sequences. But as the Tokyo arc segued into the more serious Kyoto arc, the mood would be set by stronger orchestral tracks, with a slight western, almost cowboy motif, which included the heavy use of acoustic guitar. The scope of the music in the Kyoto arc felt so much bigger and sweeping than what we got in the Tokyo arc. They feel heroic, epic, and operatic in some ways. Rightfully so, given the danger Kenshin was facing was a threat to all of Japan. The bones of the Remembrance arc's narrative are so strong, and the production of the original anime was, overall, so good, that simply adapting Trust and Betrayal as a continuation of the anime would have been a great viewing experience. But the project runners instead made creative choices which, while still faithfully telling Kenshin's tale, has its own identity and stands alone as a beautiful piece of art. The first noticeable change is the art direction. From the sharper and more exaggerated anime style with bright colors, which work well in a shonen action story, Trust and Betrayal was a deliberate choice to ground Kenshin's past. It necessarily needed to adjust the art style to fit an atmosphere not of excitement, whimsy, and nostalgic yearning for an idealized bygone era, but rather mourning for the past. Trust and Betrayal used more natural and realistic character designs. The animation is not photorealistic, but you can see clear differences in how characters were drawn and the more solemn moods and feelings they were meant to evoke. The color palette is also noticeably different. The Rurouni Kenshin anime and colored pages of the manga used vibrant colors, especially reds and pinks, to create the romantic tales taking place in the bright Meiji era. But Trust and Betrayal relies heavily on dark and drab blues, except for certain shots, most noticeably the spray of blood. Almost as if, to Kenshin, the world has become a dark, somber, and oppressive place. As an assassin, he lives in the shadows, and the only thing that really brings him out of the darkness is the bloodshed. Perhaps that realization that he's floating through the world as a monster bathed in shadow, with only the next kill to look forward to, is further crushing his soul. The few moments of daylight we see are usually when Kenshin is living his life with Tomoe. Tomoe herself has an iconic look. Her color motif is white. Her skin is milky white, akin to the character which inspired her, Evangelion's Rei Ayanami. Her kimono is also white, which resembles the pure white kimono with which Japanese people adorn the dead, and foreshadows her fate. The contrast between the dark Kyoto and the stark white of Tomoe somehow enhances her beauty, and that's an important thing. Beauty is only beautiful in contrast to the unsightly. Light is only light against dark, much like how Tomoe herself became a beacon of light in Kenshin's dark world. As for the music, oh, this music. Trust and Betrayal's score was created by composer Taku Iwasaki, who is also responsible for another favorite, Witch Hunter Robin. For Trust and Betrayal, instead of carrying over the epic feel from the Kyoto arc, Iwasaki scored what feels like a more personal track list to match this very personal story. Yes, like in the Kyoto arc, what Kenshin is fighting for has consequences that affect all of Japan. But whereas in the Kyoto arc, Kenshin was in direct opposition to Makoto Shishio, that arc's big bad, the main conflict in Trust and Betrayal is not Kenshin trying to help bring about the end of the Tokugawa government. That's just the backdrop to watch the individual cost of bringing about a new era, specifically the personal toll revolution and killing take on the human soul. Trust and Betrayal is about redemption and contrasting Kenshin's inner kindness and naivety against the effective tool of war that politicians needed him to be. Iwasaki captured this with brooding and often haunting tracks which make use of abrupt changes to pace and tone. Throughout the entire soundtrack, there are two leitmotifs which permeate many of the songs. This one is most often played on the flute and seems to be a representation of Kenshin's innocence, kindness, and capacity for love, as well as Tomoe's own recognition of Kenshin's inherent humanity. The other is most often heard on horns with oboe accompaniment and seems to represent Kenshin's will and determination. These leitmotifs are the musical incarnation of Kenshin, and the way they're used in conjunction with, or in contrast to, other parts of songs in which they're incorporated helps show us Kenshin's inner turmoil. They are sometimes played with different instruments, in different keys, or embedded within other songs with varying levels of harmony or dissonance. And each of these changes show us Kenshin's ever-shifting emotions as his life is turned upside down by the tides of the revolution, and help us achieve greater emotional resonance with Kenshin's struggle to keep his humanity. If there was a theme song for Trust and Betrayal, it would be two songs, which are more like two halves of one song. In Memories, A Boy Meets the Man, and In Memories, Kotowari. Through use of instrumental choices and dynamics, they convey two distinct phases and aspects of Kenshin's journey, before he met Tomoe and after. So powerful and lasting was her impact that the heart of his theme song must necessarily change to reflect it. In Memories, A Boy Meets the Man is haunting and cold, more of a dirge with a slow, inevitable thumping drum. It evokes a feeling of desolation. It was used for the opening scene as Kenshin is being sold into slavery. The introductory drum beat is both solemn and haunting, filled with strange, screeching noises, as if wild animals are waiting in the darkness. But even those noises never disrupt the implacable thumping of the drums. This suddenly gives way to the leitmotif representing Kenshin's innocence, which again segues back into the thumping of the drums, as the boy becomes caught in the inevitable march of events beyond his control, a slave to fate. Eventually, the song picks up in intensity with a quasi-heroic, or at least marginally less ominous section, using an incomplete version of the second leitmotif as Kenshin meets the man who will teach him Kenjutsu and empower him to take his fate into his own hands. The use of the leitmotif here is interesting since it's more the bassline and backing track. In contrast, in Memories, Kotowari adds a more energetic drum beat. Gone is the leitmotif representing Kenshin's childish innocence, as that aspect has finally been stripped away from him with Tomoe's death. But that doesn't mean Kenshin's fundamental goodness and humanity have been lost. The second leitmotif is prominently used in Kotowari. It somehow feels complete, as if Kenshin's resolve is finalized. Kenshin knows what he must do. He made a commitment to help bring a new age for Japan. Once the revolution ends, he will atone for his sins and never kill again. The design and production decisions come together to create a heart-wrenching story. You watch and hope against hope that Kenshin and Tomoe will be happy. But even without knowing Kenshin's future from the manga and anime, the design elements convey to us that this story won't end with the two growing old together in peace. And yet, that knowledge somehow takes what could be seen as an oppressive darkness to the design and imbues it with a tragic sense of beauty. Along with the aesthetic and stylized differences mentioned before, Trust and Betrayal changed the way the story would be told narratively. If the mainline Rurouni Kenshin manga and anime was shonen action manga fare, which slowly became an action epic, then Trust and Betrayal was more a straight period drama, which happens to have action. It seems like a fine line, but when you watch the two side by side, it's a striking difference. Rurouni Kenshin can often be cute and silly.
おいなんだこのイタチ娘は
On a reread of the manga, I was struck by how suddenly the tone shifted to something comedic. It was a series that toyed with heavy topics for sure, and for those deeper moments, Watsuki usually played it straight. But every once in a while, even in the middle of life or death crises, there would just be a small frame of someone making a funny anime face. It played a delicate balancing game of trying to tackle political and social topics that plagued the Meiji era, and injected some levity. It never forgot that these were still light-hearted, romantic tales set in, as even Watsuki admits, an imaginary and idealized Meiji era. The anime and manga played into the tropes of shonen action. You had larger-than-life villains, sometimes literally, stalwart heroes, a focus on exciting battles with physics-defying movement, and of course, the ever-classic trope of calling your moves. While not solely limited to anime, calling your moves is one of those narrative idiosyncrasies that permeates Japanese action aimed at kids. You're about to unleash a powerful attack? Gonna strike the final blow that will end your enemy? Make sure you yell the attack's complicated name. Rurouni Kenshin was not above this fun little narrative conceit. When Kenshin used a specialized technique from the Hiten Mitsurugi's arsenal, he would make sure we knew exactly what it was. Trust and Betrayal didn't do that. And to be clear, this must have been a deliberate decision, as the original manga version of Tsuiokuhen shows Kenshin engaging in this trope. In this OVA, Kenshin kills quickly and efficiently. While the combat shown in Trust and Betrayal is certainly a heightened reality, in all but a few cases it feels within the realm of possibility, especially compared to the source material. It's more grounded, brutal, and often very graphic. Shonen manga doesn't necessarily shy away from graphic portrayals of violence, and Kenshin certainly didn't. But there was always a feeling of excitement and adventure to it, a sense of spectacle. Things like Kenshin, Dragon Ball, Naruto, and other Jump comics can be compared to something like Hong Kong kung fu movies. It's high-flying action fun. I'm not sure the combat shown in Trust and Betrayal can be called fun. The audience can certainly enjoy watching it. It's exciting, thrilling, and the choreography is great to watch, for sure. But the goal isn't to make us smile. It's to show us the horrors Kenshin witnessed and inflicted on others during the harsh era of the Bakumatsu. Kenshin and his enemies kill, and they do so without hesitation. They don't revel in it. There's no big action poses. It's all so cold and dehumanizing, which I think is the point. The dehumanizing nature of violence. Let's look at another staple of shonen manga. The stalwart and noble hero doesn't want to fight and gives his enemy a chance to end the conflict. This is often followed by a speech where the protagonist helps the enemy to see the error of their ways. This trope has become colloquially named Talk no Jutsu. Trust and Betrayal and its manga counterpart have Kenshin do the same thing. He offers a clearly outmatched young samurai a chance to surrender. The difference is the motivation behind it. Kenshin isn't saying, if you surrender, we can talk this out and have a happy ending. He's saying, if you surrender, I can give you the courtesy of a quick and painless death, and it saves me the hassle of a fight, which I will win. It's a kind gesture in perspective, but it's still one with murderous intent. Or how about this part, where the mortally wounded Kiyosato reaches for the apparition of his beloved Tomoe. In a more standard anime, it might cut to white, and the spirit of Kiyosato would be embraced by the image of Tomoe, and he would find peace in the moments before his death. Instead, we get a mortally wounded Kiyosato, face distorted by pain and tears, just repeating over and over how he doesn't want to die. Reaching for that peaceful and heavenly image of Tomoe, he utters, To-mo, and before he can finish her name. While this scene exists within the manga, compare the face of Kiyosato in his final moments. Look at how the pain of Kiyosato is being expressed, how the effects of violence have caused him to lose any sense of composure or dignity. He died a violent death, and Trust and Betrayal more readily shows that pain. There was no satisfying narrative closure, no going, at least he got that one moment of peace before he passed into the afterlife. Just a man painfully cut down before his time. It stands in stark contrast to what we might expect from the romantic vibes in the Rurouni Kenshin franchise, and changes our view of our protagonist. Another important and noticeable change was giving depth to our titular hero. See, in a lot of shonen anime, the hero is kind of flat. They don't really change. Look at one of the most classic examples of the shonen action hero, Goku. Goku as a character doesn't really develop over the course of Dragon Ball. Sure, he gets physically stronger, but his core personality remains much the same. Instead, shonen protagonists change the world around them. They make the people they protect better by being determined, good-hearted, and doing the right thing. Kenshin during the main series is similar. He seems less flat than Goku or Naruto in that his overall struggle is a personal one. He wants to remain true to his goal to never kill and to overcome his Batosai personality. He has to face off against not only physical challenges, but challenges to his worldview. But even that struggle isn't necessarily one of deep growth. Ultimately, Kenshin is trying to remain the good person we met in the first episode, rather than growing and developing. Instead, Kenshin draws people to him and changes hearts and minds away from their darker instincts. However, in Trust and Betrayal, Kenshin rarely changes the world around him. He's merely a cog, albeit a prominent one, in the systemic change the imperialists want to achieve. It is Kenshin who is changed by the world, the inverse of the shonen formula. He starts as an innocent child, sees the chaos of the world around him, and becomes determined to protect others. This naivety leads him to burying the child he is and adopting a cold and detached demeanor, only to meet Tomoe, who instills in him a yearning for peace and regret for what he has done and what he's become. And finally, with Tomoe's death, a renewed determination. While it may not seem obvious given the subdued performances, Kenshin changes and matures over the course of the OVA, which makes his character so much more compelling than other flat anime heroes. Perhaps one of the biggest changes was downplaying Kenshin's dual nature as two distinct personalities. Throughout the Tokyo and Kyoto arcs, there was a focus on the duality of Kenshin's heart. The goofy but kind-hearted vagabond who detested fighting versus the aggressive and arrogant Kenshin that seemed to enjoy combat and implied to be the face Kenshin wore during the violence of the revolution. The original manga and anime never really made a decision on whether or not Kenshin had some type of fictionalized dissociative personality disorder. Instead, just saying that Kenshin's heart was in conflict between the personality he built as the Batosai and the post-revolution wanderer. Sometimes it's portrayed as just a mood shift, like many people experience. But because the difference between the emotional states of goofy vagabond and the killer swordsman were so stark, it sometimes felt like two separate beings in one body. The problem was always that Kenshin wouldn't just sporadically have bouts of anger or aggression. In combat, his entire demeanor and even some physical features seemed to change. It would actually require his friends, and more often than not, Kaoru, to pull him back to his wanderer personality. This was once hilariously lampshaded when his regular calm disposition had returned, but his face got stuck in its angry mode. Trust and Betrayal downplayed the binary delineation in Kenshin's fragmented heart. There weren't necessarily two distinct aspects to Kenshin's personality, the killer and the man of peace fighting for supremacy. There are, of course, mentions of Kenshin having two distinct sides in Trust and Betrayal, but it's never really shown as clearly black or white, and seems to be an artifact from the mainline series that sticks out in this more grounded incarnation. In fact, I don't think the struggle was between Kenshin reveling in combat, as his more aggressive personality from the manga and anime seemed to do. That Kenshin was on the cusp of becoming a bloodthirsty killer. In the OVA, Katsura says that Kenshin is like a brandished sword, wild and ready to kill, but that every sword needs a sheath, where a sword can be at rest, and he wants Tomoe to be that sheath. In the OVA, the issue was Kenshin, in his function as an assassin, put on a mask of coldness, and each kill was slowly destroying his spirit. The threat wasn't that he was becoming wild and bloodthirsty, but rather that he was slowly becoming numb to the killing and losing his inner light. Compared to the Batosai persona from the Tokyo and Kyoto arcs, which was abrupt, rude, and sarcastic, Trust and Betrayal's Batosai was merely cold. He wasn't insulting, he rarely spoke haughtily, he just did his job. And as the killings became more routine, he got used to them and became used to death. So in Trust and Betrayal, he really wasn't a brandished sword, drawing ever closer to reaching some threshold of insanity like Jine from the Tokyo arc, but rather a child coming to terms with the horrors of the assassin he volunteered to become. It's such a small change, but I think this shifting of the focus of Kenshin's inner struggle makes it more relatable to the audience. And if he wasn't a brandished sword, he doesn't really need a sheath. Instead, what Tomoe was able to do was help Kenshin uncover the innocence and softness he buried. She taught him that he could be more than a killer, that underneath all he had done, he was still the little boy who wanted to help others. In some ways, Tomoe was the opposite of a Sheath. She helped draw out Kenshin's humanity. She helped him find happiness with a simple life, that his value was more than a living weapon. By bringing down the fantastical elements of Kenshin's inner struggle and reframing it away from Kenshin's heart being torn between a killer and a kind warrior, to Kenshin just trying to keep some shred of his heart intact, we feel for him, and that relatability helps us see the misfortune of it all. All Kenshin wanted to do was help people and stop the suffering of the era. He joined the Imperialists because he thought a new age would help the oppressed be happy and free. He was innocent and naive, but Kenshin didn't realize the practical means and sacrifices necessary to achieve a new world. The cost in blood. And so, as many heroes do, Kenshin sacrifices his own happiness in the hopes that tomorrow would bring something better. That inner struggle is much more relatable than the more overt personality back and forth we see in the main series. That relatability helps draw us into this beautifully crafted story and more acutely empathize with the depth of his sadness. The notion of beauty through tragedy is not unique to Japan. All cultures have their stories of star-crossed lovers who would rather die together than live apart, or of noble heroes riding valiantly into certain doom. Something about these tales resonates deeply within us. It forces us to realize the ephemeral nature of life, and from that, we take a moment to appreciate the blessings in our own lives, the things we take for granted. Trust in Betrayal takes this heart-wrenching story of a boy caught up in a turbulent world and crafts something remarkable. Trust in Betrayal is beautiful in its own right as a work of art. From the animation, to the music, to the narrative choices, which make it a perfect complement to the mainline Rurouni Kenshin series, but also stand alone. And just like Kenshin and Tomoe's time together, or the falling pink cherry blossoms, that beauty only makes how quickly the experience ends a little more sorrowful. Even though we could see the cherry blossoms again next year, or in the case of Trust in Betrayal, whenever you decide to rewatch it, you'll never be able to recapture that first time. The first time you watched young Shinta bury the bodies of the women who protected him. The first time you saw Kenshin and Tomoe, two victims of cruel destiny, find love and peace. The first time you saw Kenshin's happiness torn away from him by the machinations of the age. The sorrow of having witnessed something so powerful for the first time, and the knowledge that you'll never be able to recapture those ephemeral emotions with the same impact. And that too is tragic. But it makes the first time you viewed Trust and Betrayal all the more special for it.